all, please mute your phones and try not to speak loudly when the speakers are speaking or throughout the entire round as to not disrupt the debate. The live stream's up, so if at any point the speakers want to redact consent, just let me know and I'll call an OC member to stop the stream. My panelists here will kindly time the debate with the bell sound, so just checking everyone can hear it. Good enough, but also please keep time of yourselves to avoid any confusion. Like, BP rules have not changed the last time I checked, so offer POIs between 6 minutes. We will stop taking notes at 7:15. All the best for the PDOs. All right, I call the House to order and invite the Prime Minister. Give here.
People ought not spend their lives ruled over by unelected aristocrats from the bench, having their life, liberty, and bodies ruled over by people who don't represent them and have nothing to do with their ways of life and don't fundamentally understand them. So points of framing, then 3 arguments. Firstly, on why fundamentally, full stop, democratic elected governments are better actors to be deciding over what people do with their lives. Secondly, why we avoid the politicization of courts on side government, which is an existential threat to legislative bodies. Thirdly, a principle so very happy I get to talk about one for the first time this term. Let's give a few points of framing. Firstly, vote, pretty simple. Don't think we need to explain what that means or what that looks like. We think we're willing to defend all cases of constitutional or court amendments. We're not going to try and pick and choose here on OG. Obviously, there's going to be some bad cases. We say the good are better than the bad. Notice what Supreme Courts look like. The vast majority of cases, they're appointed by governments. They're people who spend a great deal of time, firstly in law school, then generally in practice, then as judges. This means that you're extremely old at the point you have enough sort of experience to be the kind of person who gets even considered for an appointment on a Supreme Court. So just flat out, you are 1, substantially more rich, and secondly, substantially more old than any politician could possibly be. This will be important in a second. But we also want to point out that we still maintain some ability to legislate from the bench on our side of the debate. If it's the case that something is so obviously correct, and the vast majority of people in the government agree, it's still possible for the Supreme Court to change these laws, but it's just the case that when they disagree, that's where this debate happens, and we think it's only in the cases where the Supreme Court and the sort of legislature disagree that opposition is likely to fail. If there's any points on framing, I'll take them.
Who specifically is likely to get appointed to this? Not a characterization, but what are these kinds of people running against these?
Incredibly rich white men, rich white women as well. Let's get into the first point. Why are democratic governments substantially better than Supreme Courts? The first point is, again, bringing in the framing. They're substantially richer. Like, obviously there are some people of color on the Supreme Court, but we think age and class are exceptionally important here. Because for you to be, like, basically every single person on the US Supreme Court until the most recent nominee, I can't remember their name, went to Yale Law School, right? Who goes to Yale Law School, guys? Is it people who are from a trailer park? Is it people who are from, like, the Bronx? Is it people who've struggled in their life? Probably fucking not. But what that means is the people making decisions over your life lack any kind of personal experience with the kinds of sort of things that they decide. When they say, we think it's legitimate for a person in this type of circumstance to spend the rest of their life incarcerated, when we think it's reasonable for us to send someone who's grown up in poverty to the gallows and die, they have no fucking clue what that looks like, and there's no institutional capacity of those kind of experiences the way you get in democratic governments, where people have, and yes, I know there's shitty things like redlining, and there are problems with elections, but the alternative is some representation versus none. Secondly, there's a lot more accountability for democratic governments. Supreme Court judges spend their entire life making lots of money, basically doing whatever they want to. I know people can protest outside of Brett Kavanaugh's house, but do you really think that changes anything about his personal incentives? And obviously you can do that with politicians too, if they're voting in ways that are really shady, the way Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin saw people protesting outside of their house. I think it's much more the case that when you have direct electoral incentives, like you will lose the next election, you have to take your constituents seriously, even if it's the case that you don't come from poverty, and there are a lot of politicians who do, let's be very clear, but even when you don't, you're still accountable to people who are. That's really important. Thirdly, even if you don't believe any of these decisions are better, lay people understand them more, so they're more likely to internalize them well. Because I don't know if you've ever read a Supreme Court decision, they're really complicated, full of jargon, full of tons of shit you've never heard of in your life. Whereas politicians, they spend their whole lives explaining things to their constituents. So even if the decision is de facto legitimate, if people don't feel that way because they don't understand what it means, because a politician isn't the one explaining it to them, then it's not. The impact of this argument is just, you're more likely to actually get things like legislation that protect women's rights, protect POC rights, protect the poor. That's incredibly good. Legislation substantially better. Massive margin of change there. Yes, opening?
When constitutions are constructed, they typically include protections that stop leaders from grabbing power unilaterally. Who's more likely to overturn those protections?
I think that in a lot of instances, if your close friends appointed you to a place, you're probably also likely to do things that benefit them in a sort of you scratch my back, you scratch back kind of way. I don't think there's a lot of exclusivity here. Second argument on politicization of court. Notice that there's substantially less reason for you to pack. Because one of the big successes of Trump's presidency is that he was able to pack the court in such a way so as Roe v. Wade gets repealed when the Republicans are outside of power. There's really not a whole hell of a lot you can do about that. Legislation takes time. Legislation is incredibly difficult when things are blocked, when you have to debate about things, when people have the ability to, whatever the term is when you come up and you make things slow and you stonewall. I can't fucking remember words today. But the point is that when you don't have the incentive to pack one, probably you're more likely to get the best people for the job in terms of sort of interpretive question perspective, but as well, it's unlikely these appointments are going to be made as politically, and so the decisions of the Supreme Court are no longer political. But what this means is you don't get court flip-flopping, so there's not constant changes in decisions. So for instance, if someone wants to start a business with the expectation that something like, drugs are going to be legal or providing abortion services, they have the knowledge that the way they plan their life is likely to be substantially more consistent. This means that people's life don't get ruined because of arbitrary court flip-flopping, because a Democratic Supreme Court justice was replaced by a Republican, and now they're just going to do things in an unelected way. And again, Democratic governments are much less likely to be conducive to these, but as well, just lastly on the principle, I think people deserve to have a say over what happens to them. I think that the difference between living in a totalitarian state and a democratic one is that I get to decide collectively with all the other people in Canada, and all the other Canadians in this room, what it means to be a Canadian, what our shared future is as a group of people, and I think that's a beautiful thing. I think every day I wake up, I feel happy that I'm not constantly being forced to do things that I don't want to do, or at least that I do. There's some recourse for me. I can go to the polls and vote. I can go and I can protest. I can hold the people accountable. Even if there's some cases where bad decisions are fair, this principle is still likely to extend, but people die for the right to sort of determine their own shared future. People die over nation, and it clearly is incredibly important to people. That's why I'm so proud of it.
I thank the Prime Minister very much for that speech. I'd like to next invite the Leader of Opposition.
Constitutions protect our democracies. And who benefits when democracies are torn down? It's people who can grab power and use that power to serve their own ends. And those people are never Supreme Court justices. They're legislatures, they're leaders, they're politicians who benefit explicitly from the checks on powers being removed from them. I'm going to do one major thing in this speech. I'm going to compare the decision-making ability of politicians and Supreme Court justices and explain why Supreme Court justices are far better at making decisions, and even if they're worse, it's useful to have a check on the decision-making power of legislatures. But before that, very briefly, two responses to the principle. Firstly, democracies are not absolute. We constrain them in a number of ways. We don't allow people to directly vote on bills. We have representative democracies. We have things like technocrats running financial or monetary systems, because we understand that people wouldn't be able to make those decisions in legislative capacities. The point of this analysis is to suggest to you that democracies are not an absolute principle, but rather one that is constrained by outcomes. And we would explain to you, secondly, that outcomes need to be the thing that dictate this debate, because the kind of principled outcomes of this debate far outstrip those of democracies. We're talking about the principled outcomes of people being able to live in a democracy at all. We're talking about the principled outcomes of people having access to housing, shelter, food, all of the basic things that they need to survive. So, to the extent that you believe that constitutions are important to protect other principled obligations that we might have, you believe that the best decision-making is truly the pathway to the principled victory in this debate. Let's get into the meat of this. Who makes better decisions, governments or Supreme Courts? We would tell you that there are broadly two ways that governments are likely to make these decisions in their world. The first, and likely the majority of these kinds of decisions, will be based on electoral incentives, and the second is unilateral incentives, incentives they have when they are not constrained by electoral outcomes. I'm going to first deal with the best case scenario for these guys and talk about electoral incentives. We think that there are broadly two problems with this. The first problem is that electoral incentives are generally constrained by things that we would deem to be very bad. Things like majoritarianism, when large swathes of the population have active incentives to fight against smaller parts of the population. Things like populism, where large portions of the population can be swayed and buy into the rhetoric of one particular leader telling them that the short term is all that matters. This particular policy is all that matters. We are talking broadly about swathes of the population who don't consider the long term, who think about only bad incentives or poor incentives. Notably, this doesn't happen all the time in electoral systems, but it is a problem that is unique to electoral systems that Supreme Court justices are typically not constrained by. And that's important because it means that even if you believe 1, 2, 3% of decisions are being made on majoritarian bases, are being made on populist bases, those are the kinds of decisions that fundamentally erode people's rights. Notably, the comparativist Supreme Court justices protecting constitutions, which were typically written from behind veils of ignorance, from situations where you have to set things up equally because you don't know what the future looks like. You don't know the minority group that deserves oppression into the future because they are not in your country yet. There's no reason to hate them yet. The Supreme Court justices defend that constitution. On their side of the house, anytime there is a new form of hate, anytime there is a new reason to change things, that can be changed. And when it is done poorly, it is done in such catastrophically poorly ways that we wouldn't support it. But secondly, even if you believe that majoritarianism and populism are too small of an instance in this debate, electoral cycles are very poor incubating chambers for decisions being made. That is because decisions aren't made on the best merits of their outcome, but typically large-scale decisions like this one, the kind that leaders will be putting forward during electoral cycles, are made on the basis of slugging through opponents or finding small pockets of the electorate that you need to appeal to, the racist 10% that you need to get on side to win the vote, and using this as the ticket through which to get them on side, saying that if we get a simple majority, we will push through this legislation to get a wall up on the side of our border. And that's important because what it explains to you is that this side of the debate needs to explain to you why decisions would be made well, in an informed way, in a rational way, in a measured way, rather than falling prey to the worst part of electoral cycles. All of this analysis explains to you why in the majority of decisions they will be made poorly. But secondly, we would explain to you that the worst case scenario for these guys is governments making decisions in unilateral fashion. And notably, this debate doesn't just apply to the United States. It also applies to contexts like Hungary 10 years ago, or Tunisia 6 months ago, the kinds of democracies that are nascent or weak or vulnerable to predation. And we'd explain to you it's that precisely in these contexts, giving leaders who already want to seize power further ways to seize power, further ways to roll back the protections on them claiming control of that country is an extraordinarily poor way of going about this. Notice that they can grab power easier in 2 ways. Firstly, there is a greater scope of power for them to grab as they're able to tear down the protections of the Constitution and put that power in their hands instead. But secondly, notably, there are also now fewer checks against them seizing power because the Supreme Court can't block decisions. The Supreme Court can't stop them from doing the other ways that they might want to seize power. And that's precisely what happened in Tunisia when the elected leader took control of the judiciary such that they could push through power quicker than anybody else in Tunisian history. Notably, they can say things like, well, you might be able to just do this in a status quo. People can already power grab. But notably, my analysis not only explains why it gets worse and easier, but notably, it also explains why if people want to use other mechanisms of grabbing power, this is the precise mechanism that allows them to do so far easier. Before I get on to explaining courts closing.
You have an incredibly rosy-eyed view of constitutions. These were written with incredibly regressive norms 300 years ago, in a place where half the people in the country were literally not considered people, which is why you have things like the 3/5 clause.
Yes, and that's also why the constitutions are being updated over time, because there are mechanisms to update constitutions. You have populaces who are able to vote over these things over substantial periods of time. You have Supreme Courts that are able to use reasoned processes of deciding the way forward for a country. It's not the case that all constitutions are baked into history. And by comparison, we would suggest that constitutions are generally broad enough to interpret through the modern lenses in faithful ways. Let's talk about courts. Because they might say, well, courts are unilateral, they're packed with old people. But there are a number of reasons to believe that courts are far preferable. Firstly, courts internally check against each other. So even if they have ideological biases, other people have opposite ideological biases, forcing them to reason and come to good outcomes. Secondly, they're generally bound by the rules of constitutions or frameworks of rules at all which prevent them from going hog wild with power. Thirdly, they're constrained by the legislature to the most extent, to the greatest extent, which is to say that the general legal norms of the country allow for the legislature to check back against the court. But fourthly, even if they do want to use power poorly, they have no incentives to do so because they have no capacity to grab power from it. These guys say that, well, they're appointed by government, so there's a scratch my back, I'll scratch yours type dynamic. But in situations like this, neither side of the debate actually changes, right? Like in situations where the court is essentially just an arm of the legislature already, we're just talking about the government bench in this debate. So, notably, why would these courts make good decisions? Two reasons. First, all the analysis I already provide explains why they check against each other and use helpful structures. But secondly, we would explain that those on the legislatures are typically checked against each other before they become Supreme Court justices, which is to say you need a 30-year career of doing the right thing before becoming a legislator. Which means that even though the old and rich part of this debate is symmetric, the competent and good at your job and understand Constitution part of this debate certainly isn't, which is the reason why we would prefer courts making these decisions rather than legislators. Thanks.
I thank the Leader of Opposition for that speech, and I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
Courts can give it, but courts can also take it away. They correctly point out that in some cases, Supreme Courts and constitutional courts protect the fundamental rights of people, but what they entirely miss is all our analysis of how in many cases they can also take away the fundamental rights of people, and why, given all of the structural reasons we give you, they are in many cases more incentivized to do so. Let's start with some rebuilding. In response to our point on why democratic governments are simply better actors than high courts, they say that it is the case that these courts are going to protect democracies against the rise of authoritarian leaders. I have two responses. First is a point of mitigation. I'm unclear in how many cases this is going to make the difference in whether an authoritarian comes to power. If I'm an authoritarian and I have an awful lot of support, say, in the military, say, beyond that, in the economy, I might be able to just, for example, abolish the court or do a successful January 6th and then take over regardless. So I'm unclear as to how many cases this is going to be a tipping point in whether an authoritarian comes to power. But my second response is that even if you don't buy that at all, it is simply the case that in many cases these high courts can be used to enable authoritarian takeovers, to, for example, block a policy that is done by a non-authoritarian party, and, for example, to enact a wide sweeping changes to a political system that benefits whatever authoritarian party is in power. Now, why is it the case that we believe that courts are more likely to help the kinds of authoritarian takeovers that we're concerned with than to prevent them? Because, in many cases, when courts are playing the part of the stooge, it is because they have been directly meddled with by elected officials. This looks like court packing, this looks like, in some cases, even bribery. And which kinds of parties are more likely to do this kind of meddling? It is generally authoritarian or authoritarians wanting to be parties, right, and populists, etc. Why? Because, in many cases, these parties don't actually care about doing good things and just want power for power's sake, so they're more willing to do just blatantly immoral things like the kinds of meddling that we described, but also because their electoral base doesn't care about, like, taking the high road, if you want to go with Michelle Obama's quote, and so they're less incentivized to, left-wing parties care about the sort of illegitimacy of the court system, working within the rules, playing fair, etc. So indeed, on our side, you get less of an enabling of authoritarian takeovers. But also, just to quickly flag, we got no response whatsoever to all our analysis on avoiding the politicization of the court. So even if you think, like, whether we get more or less fundamental rights is a wash, I think we can still win on the fact that in many, many cases, which aren't necessarily explicitly political, we just get much, much better judicial decision-making on a wide range of issues that affect many people's lives. Like, this debate isn't just about fundamental rights, it's also about just all of the ways in which our legal system structures our lives, all the ways, the unsexy ways in which courts change how people can exist in the modern world. Next, on a principle, we explained to you why we do have a right of collective self-determination and why principles do in fact matter. Please consider it. If practical is a loss, I think this principle is on its own sufficient to witness this debate. What are the responses that we get? First, we get, well, there's all sorts of, like, technocrats in democracy and bureaucrats doing all sorts of stuff. But the problem is that there's a difference here. In many cases, bureaucrats can be fired when they are doing a really, really bad job, whereas in most Supreme Court systems, the justices served for life can't be fired, and so there's some accountability and some collective determination when there are these bureaucrats, but none when there are high courts. Now, with that all out of the way, let's go on to some comprehensive refutation. But first, let's go back up.
Scenario. The Republican Party grabs the majority, they win, Democrats have no power in terms of any media sphere. What happens to any sort of meaningful policy that protects any rights that the authoritarians or the Republicans no longer want to be incentivized to protect?
Counter scenario. The Democrats win a majority, as they did before Roe v. Wade got overturned, and the Supreme Court also takes a bunch of fucked up steps that are anti-democracy, anti-rights, etc. I think we've been pretty clear here that bad shit can happen on either side, but the question is about structural reasons, not just about whether, yes, there is a potential for bad shit to happen. Again, it's a likelihood analysis. I think Figure gave you all that. All right, let's do some comprehensive reputation. First, they say that governments are better decision makers for a range of reasons. That governments are worse decision makers for a range of reasons. First, they say that they have majoritarian tendencies. I think we can pretty easily outweigh this on the fact that in many, many cases, what benefits the majority also benefits everyone else. Like, I think we have a very narrow conception of this debate thus far that assumes that all the cases that matter are trade-offs between minority rights and majority rights. No, there's just a lot of cases where, like, how an economy will work, where something that benefits the majority just also has trickle-down benefits for literally everyone else. So I'm unclear on why why this matters the most in this debate. But also, we explain oftentimes Supreme Court justices will have majoritarian inclinations insofar as they're often in, like, Western countries, white racist assholes, and in non-Western countries, which yes, we agree, this debate is also about them as well, similarly bigoted or majoritarian in their inclinations insofar as they come from privileged groups in those societies. So I think majoritarian probably goes our way, but at worst is a wash. All right, let's talk then about the idea of lobbying. I think we've already characterized lobbying and other kinds of pernicious ways of influencing the courts can also happen to Supreme Courts. Now, lobbying is not something that can only happen to politicians, and so again, I think that's probably symmetrical. Next, let's engage with their idea of why constitutions are so uniquely good. They say they're written behind a veil of ignorance. As our back half correctly points out, no, they fucking weren't. They were oftentimes, in most cases, written by old, racist, dead white guys, at least in the West, and analogously bad, backwards-looking sort of actors in other countries. The responses to get, well, there are amendments over time, these things change a little bit. This is purely mitigatory, because still in most cases, constitutions are backwards-looking. They reflect the preferences of previous generations, previous electoral voter bases who tend to be less inclusive, tend to be less tolerant, tend to be more majoritarian, if anything. But also, even if it's true that constitutions were written behind a veil of ignorance, they sure aren't implemented or interpreted behind a veil of ignorance. They're interpreted by these bad actors that you have characterized too. So, lastly, let's just engage with their idea on why it is that Supreme Courts are so uniquely good. First, they say it's because they check each other. They have all sorts of different perspectives. First, I want to clear up exactly what they mean by this. Like, this is also going to be true of a lot of democracies. For example, if you have a coalition government, there's also going to be a lot of different perspectives there, perhaps checking each other. Also, even just within a political party, there's often disagreements, and so there's different perspectives that check each other in that context as well. So I'm not entirely sure why this is basically why this is asymmetric in the way that they want it to be. Next, they say there's no incentive for the Supreme Court to be trying to misuse their power, to grab power, to take over, etc. I think even if we completely buy this, they still have perverse incentives to, for example, enact their fucked up worldviews if they have them, as we've characterized them to be likely to do. You don't need to want to take over a country, to turn it into an authoritarian hellscape, to be the kinds of person who thinks that women don't deserve basic rights, and to use that power that you have as Supreme Court to prevent governments from taking any steps to recognize women's rights. So, to sum up this speech, I think we've clearly shown you that we definitely have a strong principled right for people to have self-determination in the kinds of way that we described, but we also do, in fact, get more progress, more fundamental rights protected, better judicial decision-making overall. For all those reasons, we're so proud of you. Thank you very much.
I thank the Deacon for that speech. I'd like to next invite the DLO.
Open government seems to think this debate is concerned with the types of changes that courts versus legislatures are kind of conditioned to do. We've not only explained that most of those reasons are symmetric, but I'll also flip many of them throughout the speech. The more important consideration in this debate is to note that this is a debate about the ease of change, not the type of change. And the reason that both legislatures and judiciaries are potentially captured by bad interests or potentially have biases. That's why the material we give you at Lead Up is so important. We explain that the legislature already has the power of review over the judiciary in a number of cases. It requires them to pass higher bars, things like a supermajority in whatever chamber they sit in, things like legislating widely at the state level to build a consensus. And that's where the problem emerges for this team, because they remove those checks asymmetrically by giving the government simple majority power to overturn the decisions of the judiciary without recognising the balance that exists at the moment. On top of that, I'll explain why even if you believe that it's worth the trade-off, and the legislature generally has better incentives than the judiciary, that there's a cost associated with giving that much power to a single institution, no matter how they use it. The first thing I'm going to deal with is really the only material we get from opening government to explain why judiciaries have bad incentives. And they say, well, it's because of ID politics, you generally need to have spent a lot of time in law school, and that means you're old, white, and rich. The first thing I'm going to note is that's not a reason to think that you would do bad things. Old, white, and rich people aren't necessarily evil. Secondly, there's a huge amount of symmetry, which is the problem there. For instance, politicians tend to be rich and white for the reason they need to raise donors, they need to have often like some other experience to point to in order to get elected, and they often come from other places of power, like being a lawyer or being, any other type of powerful group. And I note that in particular that the symmetry is about 51%, so even if they can point out isolated instances where minorities are more likely to make it into Parliament than for a minority to make it onto the Supreme Court, what they actually need to prove is that the 51% in a legislature is more likely to be diverse than the Supreme Court, and that's something they certainly fail to do. Thirdly, we point out that often being educated and the high bar in terms of peer approval and peer review that's placed on justices is actually a good selector for them making good decisions. That is, if your decisions are constantly being overturned, if your decisions are constantly being reviewed, that's a strong push against you ever getting appointed to a Supreme Court or a Constitutional Court. And generally, that education points in the right direction. That is, it is better to have a mainstream legislative view of power, those people are educated, they're exposed to different perspectives, they're forced to have discussions, than the type of fringe people that often can get elected to the legislature. The fourth thing I'll point out is it's also easier to get captured financially as a government, right? Like this team gives you some weak reason to think that a government or a legislature, a judiciary rather, might be corrupt. But we point out that capturing government leadership is typically more likely because donations are legal and you're allowed to give them money as opposed to a judiciary where that sort of donation is banned. But the final and most important thing I want to note here is to compare the types of analysis we give you as to why judiciaries tend to make better decisions than legislatures. That is, instead of giving you identity-based reasons, we point to the fact that they have internal checks on their decision-making. That is, you need to build a consensus on these courts. We point that they need to be peer-approved. That is, you cannot, make it to the Supreme Court while being completely off-base with your peers and your decisions constantly getting overturned. And most importantly, we explain that there are already limits on the degree of judicial power. That is, they can't legislate on their own. They need to be responding to cases. They need to review and decide, applications to that court in a very public way, and things like donations are banned. And they can already be overruled. That is, you can use simple majorities to legislate already instead of overturning the decision. The reason all of this analysis is important is you've been given reasons to think that both legislatures and judiciaries can, at times, behave poorly. And what this analysis explains is that a balance of checks and balances on the two parties is clearly the most preferable way to do it. Because under their world, as soon as the legislature is captured, everything's up for grabs. Under our world, we explain that that's much less likely. We need to capture multiple institutions when those institutions already have systems of review on each other. That's the major benefit there. And that has huge consequences for real people, right? It looks like people's rights being less likely to be eroded. It looks like people having, a greater chance of access to policies which help them. Those are all real benefits, and they only emerge when you don't allow one of these two parties to have total domination over the other. The second thing I'm going to provide in this speech is about stability, and this explains why even if you don't think the system of review and checks and balances is important, simply giving this much power to the legislature is bad on its own. That is to say, now, too much fundamental change is up for grabs in every single election. All you need to do is win 51% of the seats in the legislature. You can overturn every decision made by constitutional courts, which deal in the interpretation of the law. You can overturn any set of norms which exist in the judicial system. You can essentially do whatever you want. And that poses enormous problems for democracies, which tend not to be designed with that level of change in any one election in mind. That is, you're much more likely to have things like electoral violence, things like misinformation, things like abuse of power through donations or other illegal activities. These are all much more likely when so much change is up for grabs within democracies. We point out that they weren't designed for that rate of change to occur. And whether or not you believe the type of change is more likely to be good or bad, the ease with which it now happens produces harms on its own. You're more likely to get violence, you're more likely to get instability, and those all represent severe problems. I'll take points.
You're in a double bind here. Either you live in a country with a strong culture of judicial independence, in which this is used rarely, or you live in a country without one, in which the alternative is something far more deleterious, like court packing.
No, even in a system where the power is used rarely, that's because people respond to the fact that power exists. That is, in a scenario where both parties can review each other, you're much more likely to get systems where they don't deviate or go off course or become oppressive in the first place. It's your side which gives so much more power to the legislature, breaking the balance that we described. The third thing I'm going to talk about in this speech is oppression. Because we explain to you strong reasons to think that governments are much more likely to go the way of Hungary or Tunisia onto their side of the house, and we only get two meaningful responses. The first thing to say is, well, this won't make a difference, you can do any range of other things. The three responses. Firstly, this is at best unproven mitigation. Like, they give you no reason to think constitutional courts, which often command a strong public presence, which often do have real power in the way that people have, like some sense of loyalty to the decisions made by these courts, would be incapable. Secondly, we point out that their own claim, which is that courts can be part of the evil and therefore they get a benefit, is a concession that courts do have real power, explaining the difference there, right? Like, you're much more likely to have that impression when you don't have to convince both sides to be oppressive, or you need both sides to be oppressive in the first place. And finally, we point out that this is an important, most important reason, is all the analysis we explain as to why legislatures tend to be worse. That is, they're more likely to be captured by populism, they're more likely to be captured by majoritarianism, material that gets no response. The only other material here is to say that rights could still be abused, like our system can cut both ways. But the important thing to note there is our system requires more consensus for that change to occur. The thrust of our case isn't just to explain that the types of changes they get are worse, but the ease of those changes alone is the problem. When you don't need consensus, when you don't need wide numbers of people to agree, that's where you get oppression, that's where you get corruption. That's what we prove. Proud to oppose.
I thank the dealer for that speech and everyone for top half. So open up back half and invite the member of God.
Two questions in this speech which I'm going to answer. Firstly, the kind of questions that are asked and put forward by the courts in the first place, because we think that retaliation to when legislatures want to skirt these courts' doctrines will be far worse, and we think we're going to give you why that is the case. The second thing is I'll way into this opening half clash about are courts good, are courts bad, and tell you why we give you same meta mechanisms in opening government for why we have better why legislatures are better than courts. The first thing to note is that this creates massive soft stonewalling on their side of the house. So if the court enshrines a right that you don't like, you are likely to create extrajudicial ways of imposing that right. So for example, if on their side of the house, the Democratic court enshrines the right to abortion in the Constitution, the Republican government is likely to retaliate with banning access to abortion clinics in the first place. Why is this worse? Because firstly, and I know this sounds bad, but there's way less backlash to surgery, right? Because some people still have access to abortion, it becomes less of a hot button issue because the problem isn't as obvious anymore to the average person that the Republicans are anti-abortion anymore. They're just not allocating funding like that. This often happens with majoritarian governments, maybe respecting the rights of minorities, but not actually giving them any funding, not giving them any reparative obligations or budgets or anything like that. Thirdly, it looks like you enshrining the power of executive things. We think that the executive orders and other things can often be not subject to constitutional amendments, and they have ways of skirting these things. They look like presidents just doing things when Obamacare was going to be repealed by the court, Obama just abused executive power to the point where he could do insane amounts of things and pass Obamacare de facto. We think this might be good if you consider Obamacare good, but it was bad when Trump used those same deterioration of institutions, the deterioration of the checks of the legislature on the power of the executive to do this. But why is this not symmetric, right? Because we think that they'll come up and say, and maybe POI to us, that, hey, look, you're going to say that, this is going to be you'll never come and defend this right in the first place, it's symmetric and it's worse, and at least you get some level of protection. Why is this worse? Firstly, it reduces incentive to change it in the future, which I already said. But secondly, the public, on their side of the house, the court is still likely to enshrine these rights on our side of the house, but people are more likely to listen to it. Because we think that overturning a court decision is really, really unpopular because of the analysis that they give you. This means that you get far fewer people doing it in the court. You get people from your own party saying that, hey, look, going against the Constitution is something that is wrong and you should respect the court. So the difference isn't just in how much do people, people also just listen to the court far more on our side of the house, given that they can always get around the court order if they want to on our side of the house. But thirdly, you get more optionality. The way you enshrine rights is far more partisan, right? So for example, in the status quo, there is justices who believe that there is a right of the mother and a right of the child, and we think that legislature should be left up to distinguish between those two rights and weigh between those two rights, which means that there is some right enshrined of the mother in the court in the first place, which is bipartisanly accepted because it's really unpopular to take out this bipartisan right on their side of the house, which means you get some rights enshrined which are accepted by everyone, which means that if courts are such a good institution as OO claims, you get far more power on our side of the house. That's Even if we accept it's magically easy to find loopholes in Supreme Court decisions and just over overturn them using legislative power. What you point to is symmetrical. If you hate people getting abortions, you're going to do everything in your power to screw them
No,
over.
but like on your side of the house, the cost of hating people goes far up because you have to rewrite the fucking constitution, which is really unpopular, which is like really bad. And thirdly, the political capital goes down because if you do it in shady ways that aren't put to public discourse on their side of the house, which aren't brought to the court in the first place because they're not constitutional questions in the first place, you never get the discourse that makes the backlash happen on their side of the house. But secondly, we think courts in the status quo are too polarized. And the reason for this is because courts are affected by political mechanisms on our side of the house. Some of the same reasons as like them being appointed by politicians, but often justices are often just elected. But thirdly, we think justices try to take into consideration public opinion quite often when they determine decisions of national importance, because that's like a dipstick for what the country right now thinks, which is required for all that political thing. But the problem is, on their side of the house, the people who are vocalized are not through a direct election that is telling the judge what is good, whereas on our side it is through a legislature. On their side of the house, the problem is the justices listen to the most extreme people on both sides of the spectrum, because that is who the media platforms. That is who is seen as the strongest voice in the room in the first place, which means courts, when they are politically accountable by that soft mechanism, happen far worse on their side of the house, which means you get far more polarized decisions which are likely to be unpopular and which turns all your stability arguments on their side of the house. But now we're going to tell you why you get better constitutions on our side of the house and why you think that political change is actually important. Firstly, note that there's massive amounts of coalitions in power in these places, right? We think that minorities in post-colonial states and other states that they're super concerned about have the power of they have the power of coalitions on our side of the house. They may not be able to gain a majority, but the government needs their support, both in the simple majority vote and in the future, in terms of horse trading, things like that, to be able to pass policy in the future, to be able to do anything in the future. This means that the minorities are actually represented in the legislation, but also get the ability to execute this through the power of being kingmaker in various coalitions and protecting themselves on our side of the house. But thirdly, updating the constitution is seen as really unpopular on both sides of the house. So we think that on our side of the house, we're not likely to update the constitution, right? You don't update the entire court decision or see how this precedent is set. You only say that, hey, look, this constitution is not applicable to this one scenario, or is applicable to this one scenario, which is far better because you're actually able to get some amount of accountability and change in the constitution, unlike on their side of the house, where you never change that constitution because it's very irreparably tied to national identity, because it was written by the post-colonial strugglers or the people who founded the country, which means the progressive updates that they want of constitutions never happen on our side of the house, but do happen on our side of the house when there is political will for them and when you can remove the places where this is happening in the first place. But fourthly, the youth are progressive and have forces of liberalism. OG just say that, hey look, old people are racist. I think DLO currently points out this is not true. But we tell you that the people who vote are likely to be progressive because they have access to media and they have access to other things, which means that these things are much better. But thirdly, there's a growing liberalism with the forces of Western media, which tell you that, hey look, it is important to protect rights and it is important to do these kinds of things, which means legislatures are also very likely to not overturn those kinds of rights on their side of the house. The question then is about when do the questions of constitutionality come to the fray in the first place. On our side of the house, at least they come to the fray far more often, whereas on their side of the house, because they know that there's a huge fear, on their side of the house, because they know there's a whole huge fear of court backlash that they won't be able to fix. We think that no progressive change is ever possible because people just go extrajudicially and find loopholes in the judicial system, which exist in the vast majority of laws because these laws are often written by old people who can't foresee every single circumstance that these laws might apply to and how each single law is enforced in the country in the first place, given that these countries are very dynamic. We're very proud to stand in CG.
You're here.
I thank the member of government for that speech. I'd like to next invite the member of Hart.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I'm sick and tired of teams coming into debate and pretending that these debates all happen in America or the United Kingdom or in developed countries around the world, right? I think you have to frame OG out of this debate because they have substantially no analysis on how this debate specifically impacts countries in the global south, in the developing world, and in new democracies that arise. Here's the important thing to mention on why you need to weigh those impacts above any of the impacts that we get in the developed world. Notably, there are Democrats democratic norms that exist historically in many of these nations. So this means that in either side of the world, there are going to be some democratic forces that exist through the traditional norms that hold checks and balances on power, regardless of which system you apply. However, in instances and occasions in which those democratic norms are less historically ingrained, you need to have a strong institutional framework through which you have substantial control and protection for the individuals that live in these societies. By virtue of this framing alone and OG's lack of engagement on this premise, they're out of this debate. 2 points of extension and thorough refutation of everything that we have heard. 1. Ethnic conflict in the global south and the ways in which we significantly reduce this in the context of the debate. 2. Talking about why constitutional amendment is a good process to have. Lastly, explicit refutation of everything we have heard. It is first important to characterize why this is specifically relevant in the context of countries that exist in post-colonial context. 1. These are societies that have historically been splintered by design by colonial forces, which means that minorities and majorities have been forced to be antagonistic to each other for a historically long amount of time. This means, 1, there is historical antagonism between these groups, and there is significant oppression that exists from historical minorities or majorities, depending on who was and wasn't enfranchised. This means that the tensions between these groups are significantly high, and both groups are looking for some sort of power-sharing agreement that exists in the new country that protects both of their interests. In the absence of historical democratic norms, therefore, institutional frameworks are crucial. 2 things then. 1, you lower the cost of ending ethnic conflict. This is important for a number of reasons. 1, their side has a 51% threshold for the governing of basically all the legal principles in your country going forward. This means if you are in an ethnic conflict with another group, you have less of an incentive to end said ethnic conflict because the future state that you end up forming does not give you any recourse to protect yourself from the tyranny of the majority. Insofar as you ensure that there is some independent judiciary system that exists not to protect the interests of the majoritarian system in place, but to protect the actual rule of law, you have some reason to believe that your interests as a minority group are going to be protected in the long term. This means civil conflicts like the one with the FARC, for example, are less likely to be exacerbated. The impacts of this are significant, notably less people die. This is inherently good. You are more willing to end conflict early if you are sure that you will not have to deal with the tyranny of the majority in the new state that you form. But secondly, institutional memory is super important to consider. Because note that people that have lived through authoritarian societies, it is not as if they do not have experience with courts. It is that these courts have historically been shams, who have not been considered, who have not been respected, and the interest of whoever was in power was considered more important than these courts. What that then means then is insofar as you continue to enfranchise the power of majority groups through a legislature, these courts continue to not be taken seriously, which undermines the respect of the courts in these systems. It is better on our side in which you have an independent judiciary, which retains power and the ability to check the power of the majority, because 1, you see courts work and function, so people are more likely to respect democracy going forward. This is similar then to the ways in which Mohammed Morsi, when he appointed a number of judges that just basically did whatever he wanted and overruled them at his very will, right? These types of things happen less often. People are more and less willing to actually listen to authoritarians and authoritarian backsliding, insofar as you have a court system that literally does take action, that has the power to hold accountable the tyranny of the majority and legislatures. Going forward, you establish a system of institutional memory that gets more people to respect democracy. But secondly, in terms of constitutional amendment processes, I want to point out that Sichi says this one thing in their speech where they say, oh yes, well, the cost of hating people goes up because now you have to rewrite the Constitution. Rewriting the Constitution should be fucking difficult, right? It shouldn't be easy to rewrite the Constitution because you require majority and supermajority groups to get them through. That means if you're a majority group with 60% of the people, you can't just rewrite the Constitution to only enfranchise your group, because the minimum winning coalition that you need to change the Constitution through long process of amendments is significantly bigger than just passing a law that no longer respects the right of minorities. It should be fucking hard to change the Constitution. But importantly, right, you say, okay, look, in general, constitutions are written by old white people, and they don't make progressive decisions, and constitutions, don't actually give you the progress we need in society. This is fucking ahistoric, right? Every single legal progress that has happened in the United States of America has come through a court before it ever came through an elected legislature, because they don't have political blowback, they don't have to worry about getting re-elected, and they don't have to listen to the whims of a racist, homophobic majority. Gay marriage was legalized in the United States in the court system because the elected representatives couldn't fucking figure it out, right? It is insane to me that you would suggest that somehow we're going to get more majority from the politicians that are basically subservient to these oppressive majority forces that exist. Opening.
Look, all our analysis on court capture by elites and politicization applies doubly so in devil cases. You can't just say that it doesn't apply.
Okay. here's the thing, right? You don't actually engage with any of the institutional mechanisms of respecting democracy and democratic norms. Like, it isn't that important, it doesn't really engage further. But explicit refutation of everything that we've heard so far. Notably, we get contentions from both benches in this debate about how, like, somehow elected legislatures are better actors to enact progress, right? One, this is substantially not true, because elected legislatures need only justify their decisions on the whims of their constituents. That means these do not have to be rooted in principles of law, whereas at least as a Supreme Court justice, you have the incentive to make sure that you justify your decisions on the basis of precedents, on the basis of constitutional norms and frameworks such as this. This is really important because it means then that insofar as you change your mind in terms of what values that you ascribe to and how you interpret the Constitution, you are not actually beholden to the person that appointed you. We saw this when Justice Kennedy, who was literally appointed by the conservative Ronald Reagan, voted in favor of legalizing same-sex marriage in the United States because his interpretation of the Constitution changed. This is not symmetric because you as a politician who is still beholden to a radical base could not change your opinions because you would then lose your fucking election, right? This means that having to justify your decisions on the basis of the rule of law means that you actually substantially, can significantly change your opinions over a long period of time, and you don't have to worry about blowback. But lastly, insofar as we talk about the capture of the courts and politicization, notably, insofar as you know that the Supreme Court can change or challenge your decisions going forward, and you know that at some point your elected party might not be in power, you are forced to hedge your bets in terms of which Supreme Court justices you choose to appoint. So if your party is no longer in power, who would you want to be doing judicial review for when the other party is in power? Parties must then compromise and elect judges that are in general more moderate with their interpretations, which is not symmetric on your side of the House, because if you don't like the result of the court, you can just change it by simple majority vote, meaning you want more political judges. So proud to oppose in the context of this debate.
I thank the member up for that speech. I'd like to invite the Gov Whip.
I think a lot of the opposition bench arguments would be brilliant if it meant that every single court decision was going to be overturned on our side of the House. But I just do not think that this is the case. Why? Because one, people grew up around cultures that emphasize the importance of the judicial system and the reason that this is something that shouldn't be overridden and constantly checked against. Second, there's often a game-theoretic incentive for political parties to not allow the other political party to override their decisions, meaning that absolutely no policy making is going to be done. We think the reputation of these parties to get things done, to try to make sure that the policies they implement are not constantly overturned, probably checks back against this in a lot of cases. And third, how would this look on an international level? If you were a country that emphasizes the importance of things like judicial independence, of your ability to Supreme Court to succeed, and now people believe that you're starting to become hungry, we think there's an exodus of investment out of your country, you lose a lot of reputation on the international scale, and looks horrible for you. Now, I know that there's an opposition argument that then says here, but there are a lot of countries which have a very bad culture of independence, and therefore this is something that's just going to make things far worse. But there's no further analysis here, panel, as to why the alternative isn't just something like court packing, if it's something that's so unpopular that you want to override every single decision. This is particularly important because closing opposition just repeats the same exact mechanisms as opening up, but adds the additional words of ethnic conflict. I think at that point, they're already going to be out of this debate. But I'm actually going to give a clever flip to this argument, which proves why you're actually able to get better court independence in the countries that they care about on their side of the House. Let's start by engaging with closing opposition. They say that it's key in countries with ethnic conflict to have the confidence that you can have the end of a conflict through things like courts. The first thing I want to note is that courts seem to be incredibly weak in these states. The reason for this is that the executive needs to move very quickly and do things that are incredibly unpopular, like massive human rights violations, in order to maintain power within this country. So I do not think that the checks and balances that they assume exist truly do exist. But second, here's another flip, here's a flip on this argument, right? We think on their side of the House, there is a greater chance that the ethnicity believes that they can win an election than they can override the court. Why? Because courts tend to be inflexible. It is far harder to get a politician in power that is able to appoint people or have justices from your minority in the first place who are willing to represent you. But if you want to win an election, it is something that is far more probable, because when these conflicts tend to end, there tend to be power-sharing agreements where you have quotas for minorities to get represented by these parliaments. But oftentimes, when you have oppression of one minority, and that creates instability within a country, you build coalitions with other minorities that makes it more likely you have the ability to get representation in your parliament. We therefore think that if there's less of a check from the courts on their side of the house, there's a greater incentive for you to put down your arms, because you don't know if the peace deal that you'll negotiate with the legislature could just be automatically overridden by an incredibly out-of-touch court. But the third thing I want to note here is I think you're able to build trust in courts on our side of the house. Why? Because this is what Rohan told you about the mismatch of opinion between courts and the population right now. On their side, if you have a continual history of politicians believing that they can just decide to appoint people to a court, they can decide to just override the decisions or not pay any attention to it, they're probably going to continue to whittle away the powers of courts on our side of the house. But you see a more gradual trend on our side, where justices take this into consideration, communicate with representatives, are far more likely to reach out to other ends of the spectrum to try to make sure that they don't constantly have the decisions overridden. This means that over time, you're able to have more independence for these courts, because politicians have more trust in them not to completely destroy their legislation. This is really important because the vast majority of constitutional decisions just are not paid attention to by the legislature. There's huge amounts of things like pharmaceutical cases, of business cases and corporate law that exist in the United States Supreme Court right now that no people pay attention to. We think these are decisions that become more stable in these countries that they care about on our side of the house, because it means that you can establish a norm of allowing these justices to be independent as opposed to creating constant shocks of instability. What were the two things that Rohan told you that are going to be winning this round for us? The first is that you get better protection for minorities on our side of the house. If you have some sort of appointment of justices who say they're going to do things like protect abortion rights, there needs to be a huge political demand within one particular party to try to do things like implement these policies in the first place. We think the alternative is that they turn to the legislature on our side of the house, as opposed to just trying to do things like decide to appoint a burger court in order to create these protections constitutionally. Why is this something that's really important? Because first, oftentimes constitutional victories for minorities tend to be perceptual in nature. That is to say that you can have things like a nominal right to abortion and have Democrats say, this is something that's awesome, but then you'll have the legislation pass something like a the Hyde Amendment, meaning you get no federal funding for those abortions. Here's the weighing on this argument. We think that even if you want to get protections for minorities on the other side of the house, it is far more likely the most marginalized minorities, those people living in rural South and having nominal right to an abortion, but no abortion clinic near them, are probably the ones that are far more important to represent. But second, you're getting mismatched opinion on our side of the house. And I know that opening government gives this argument on the politicization of courts. I think we could take this over them in a couple of ways. First, their argument is contingent on the idea that justices can reasonably predict what the legislature is going to do, right? We provide the missing mechanism that says that we think that justices are likely going to reach out to politicians in the first place, but also these nomination processes become a game of whether justices can prove whether they are more moderate and less extremist, meaning that people don't want to decide to override these decisions. But second, we also think that they need to prove why justices would be willing to just make decisions that wouldn't be overridden, right? Oftentimes it can look very good for you as a justice if you say, I tried to do the right thing, I tried to fight for it, and this is something that was overturned. But we prove to you that justices now are more likely going to be appointed on the basis of moderation, meaning that there's a preemptive incentive to try to stop extremist decisions from being made in the first place. Go ahead, opening up.
Your characterization is in contradiction with itself. Simultaneously, you want us to believe that legislatures have so little respect for institutions they'd be willing to spam executive power, but at the same time they have enough respect for it that they would never use the power you grant.
There's two cases. There's the case in which there's no respect for things like the legislature in those countries in which we are easily able to win by proving that the courts get better. And second, there's a case in which there's some respect in which you have to go under the radar, right? You have to have things like the Trump administration continue making executive orders which are technically in violation of constitutional amendments, but nobody is able to pay attention to it simply because they're massively overwhelmed. Why is the legislature better? Because you have to trend toward the median. You have to decide not to alienate voters in order to try to ensure you build the biggest coalition possible to win, meaning this is something that is far harder to repeal. You see things like in Germany, like providing both protection for against later term abortions, but also allowing things to massive child welfare to prevent abortions in the first place, to please both liberals and conservatives. Because yes, maybe you get some good minority protections on their side of the house, but this is something that can be whittled away if one court decision is something that is overturned. But it's also something that is incredibly hard to repeal because we have slim margins that are incredibly responsive and change in between elections. People are worried about the fact that their policy can be repealed if there's no repealing policy within the next election. Last thing I want to do, weighing against opening up. They give you some analysis as to why like these judicial representatives to be something that are quite good, and I don't think our opening will properly respond to this. Rowan tells you that there's a game of forming coalitions and having youth right now, meaning you are far more likely going to have politicians that are representative minorities, rather than just asserting that these politicians are good. Very proud. Just then close the door.
I thank the member of God for that speech, and to wrap up the debate, I call upon the public.
Hi, Mom. 3, 2, 1. I think a large majority of this debate ends up being comparative, insofar as it's the case that we essentially get presumptions on how politicians are likely to act without any sort of measure for why this accountability is going to be likely. Two things in this speech, talking about CG, then talking about everybody else. CG first, because I want to note the very first 5 minutes of CG. Because what we get is essentially, this debate is symmetric in outcome, but the way that people engage with this mechanism is likely to be different. And this is how we get for accountability. I want to notice like one presumption here. Because the presumption here is that the Republican Party, who has the ability to now ban abortions, who now has a majority, who can similarly pass a shit ton of oppressive policy, is going to stop at just banning the law and not do anything further when they already have enough power to presumably change laws in far precarious ways on their side of the house anyways, right? This is just strange, because it just presumes that due to some level of backlash, they suddenly have the incentive to stop working. But two things on this. A, the extent to which this backlash and accountability is likely to work on CG is premised on an idea of how individuals and how other legislators hold these people and groups accountable. This is to say that it just depends on how much will there is for this sort of thing. Secondarily, the next mechanism on this is about like the progressive echo chamber, right? Like, response to this is like, get real. If there's a progressive echo chamber, there is an unprogressive echo chamber. It's not so clear to what extent this is the unique tipping point that changes people to opt into these things as a negative harm. So I don't know where accountability exists right on the basis of their mechanism. Let's go to the next 3 minutes out of CG then. They come out of MG and then GovWhip, right? And I have like 4 broad responses to a lot of sort of things that they get. Right? Because the other presumption here, outside of the developed world, I'm talking about third world nations that may be oppressed, that have been victims of colonial oppression, is that there's a presumption that there's a coalition of people that are able to access the sort of good things that you need. There's a coalition of people that are able to access good sorts of political will to make the changes that they want. But notably, what Madrid's framing tells you is A, that these people are structurally unlikely to exist in ways that allow them to fight for themselves politically. Why? Because they've likely been pitted against each other for ethnic conflicts by oppressors and colonizers that have existed historically before they've even come to play or even began developing these sort of democratic institutions. So on the offset, it's not likely that there's a coalition of folks that are able to do this, right? But for instance, it's like in India, right? With the disproportionate amount of Hindus to Muslims, there's no guarantee for people to get sorts of protections for themselves if it's the case that the majority is the only last layer of protection that you have to get access to pushing out legislative things. This is legislative laws. What this means is that the majority in itself is empowered to such a large extent that they are the last line of defense for democracy, inherently bad, especially when it's the case that folks are structurally unable to impose themselves onto a majority, and are also likely to be at conflict with each other due to colonizers. Next thing here is on the idea of court packing, right? I just want to note, court packing is a strange argument in this debate, also to OG, because it happens irrespectively. But note what the comparative is and why the institution is likely to be better on the opposite side of the house, because it forces 2 specific mechanisms at the point at which we don't do this motion. On our side, you need a majority to pack the court. Comparatively, you need a majority to change the Constitution. This means that insofar as you have the ability to pack the court, you already have the ability to fast forward, really oppressive legislator on governor's side of the house. It's not so clear where the check and balance is. But two, really uniquely, is that you create incentives for people to work together on our side of the house to create better outcomes. Why? Because Supreme Court justices, the nature of these appointments are long-term. You remain in this position for 30 to 40 years. You have to live with yourself. You have media that hold you accountable later down the line. That changes the way that you are likely to legislate within these sorts of things. This means that you live with yourself consistently when you have to make decisions, and you're more likely to be accountable towards these things. This is a good sort of deal because it just guarantees a built-in mechanism where people are likely to make better outcomes for themselves because they know they're in these positions for lifelong things. I also don't think this idea of lobbying is symmetric as comes out by CG and OG. Why? Because here's the thing. You are put in positions of Supreme Court justices for usually the entirety of your life, or for at the very least, positions of time that far outweigh the positions of time that would otherwise exist within like an electoral sort of appointment, like an elected sort of position. This means that you don't have the same incentives, you don't have the same ability to be swayed as opposed that you do, and you also similarly don't have the same tie to your party as Vidit tells you in their membrane. Third thing then on CG, right, and it's like the secondary presumption of how groups work together, which is maybe true in places like the US, but it isn't in the vast majority of places, even within the US, but it's definitely untrue in post-colonial places with ethnic groups pitted against each other. The symmetry here isn't how CEO is going to respond to this idea of characterization of politicians. It's the symmetry in knowledge. It's the symmetry in the way that you begin building these institutions. And this is how we also break out the opening half clash. Because this is to say that the way that we position ourselves in this debate isn't based on the actions of individual court justices, nor is it the base of the actions of politicians, but it's very simply two things. That the institution of the Supreme Court creates a guaranteed incentive for groups to know that their rights are likely to be protected on the long term because they have ways to guarantee these things that are no longer based on like the whims of politicians who may change them to any sort of need. So it means that their incentive to prolong conflict, to prolong the loss of life to a large degree suddenly goes down substantially at the point that they know they get sorts of guarantees for their own sorts of institutional laws. But it's also the case that the ways that these institutions get entrenched means that they're likely to be proliferating longer and longer as this sort of new democracy goes on further. POI from OG.
You strongly made our court packing point. It was that bad actors are more likely to court pack, so we shouldn't empower courts.
Okay, I still don't see why this matters. Even bad actors are likely to court pack under either side of the house. What this means is that on your side of the house, now they don't have just the ability to court pack. They have the ability to change the law. Like, I don't get what the difference in this house is. All I know is that you get more power on your side of the house to impose worse things. Here's how CEO just takes it over our own. Very simply, I think the majority of the opening team major cruxes hold itself to sort of two ideas. A, that the actors act in certain ways that are preferable to good sorts of legislation that are characterized by the incentives that they may have, i.e. this is to say that the court of institution pits them against each other from OO, and that the way that Supreme Court justices are likely to be characterized outside of just their long-termist roles are likely to be good things. This is to say that they characterize that the way in which change is likely to occur is very much based on the actions of these individual sorts of actors. We don't take that characterization. We take a far lower burden that is more guaranteed. And this is to say that the existence of these institutions in of itself poses the best sort of benefit to any sort of group that exists within this debate. It guarantees that there are laws that will be institutionalized and protected, and that the majoritarians can't just come in and fuck them over and take their ability to just self-actualize and self-represent like any sort of democracy. This is the most important.